welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Jackie, you look sad.
My ear, you're so loud. I had to take it out.
I'm so sorry for being
It's
loud
okay.
on this audio show
I know.
about behavior analysis, behavior analytic research.
Can I tell you that my preference would be that I would sit farther away from people that are speaking because of my muddy ear.
Oh, well.
But
no.
that's just my preference.
I see.
So that we could use that preference to determine things that you like and don't like, perhaps.
Yeah.
Boy, if only there was somebody who had done research on this area, maybe like read a whole bunch of articles on like preference assessment updates and had some really great insight into how we as practitioners can improve their use of preference assessments. Oh, wait, who's this? We do have such a person. We have Dr. Christopher Tullis on the line with us to talk all about preference assessments, or preference assessments 2.0, I think we're calling this one, because we've talked a little bit about them before. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm excited to chat a bit about a line of research, I guess, that we've had going off and on for the past a long time now, almost a decade, I guess, or at least for me personally.
You know, when you did that intro, it reminded me that we were all like in Mr. Rogers' house, and Chris was like at the door, like the speedy delivery man. I was like, oh, hey there, I'm here.
Who's this out there?
So that made me very happy. So thank you.
See, I had a thing going, Jackie, before the year, which that was not scripted, folks. That was totally came out of the blue. I was going to talk about our hierarchy of like, oh, isn't it nice? You know, I prefer when we have guests, and then Chris was going to come in, but you know
sorry, I ruined it.
You know what? No, we're pros. That's why we're pros at this. We can seg into any topic with any beginning.
At any time.
So, Chris, before we seg out of the episode itself, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your interests, your research, your background, all that good stuff.
So, how I got into behavior analysis kind of like almost everybody else. I like stumbled into it. I think this is like kind of an ongoing theme for people that are on podcasts or when we have guests in my classes and all that kind of stuff. It's like, I just fell into it. Well, I literally did. I was working in a hospital at home. I'm from Augusta, Georgia, and thought that I was going to initially become an attorney. And I got rejected from every single law school that I applied to. It's a wonderful like thing. My undergraduate mentor at UGA told me that he didn't think that I was going to be an attorney, but he was going to write my letters of recommendation anyway. And lo and behold, Rich was right. I think when I got into my master's program, he was like, I told you weren't going to be an attorney, didn't I? So I was working at home and a friend of mine said, you know, there's this place in Atlanta working with kids with disabilities. I know you don't want to be home in Augusta. Why don't you come to Atlanta where like the rest of us have moved after we graduated from UGA? And I ended up working at the Marcus Autism Center. I was going to work there for 6 months and then do something else. I thought maybe I'd go into real estate. Maybe I would do something else. I'd worked in restaurants for a long time too. So I was like, well, maybe I'll go back into doing that or something. And then 6 months turned into 6.5 years, a master's degree, and being accepted to a PhD program at The Ohio State University with a wonderful mentor named Helen Malone. And it just kind of, I guess, every research-wise and everything else kind of snowballed from there. So as a graduate student, I was really interested in choice and preference and how to make preference assessment methodologies more efficient without sacrificing any accuracy, really focusing on the output, right? The reinforcer identification part. As I've continued to kind of think about preference more, so I'm not doing as much experimental work now as I did previously, but as I'm thinking more about preference, I'm thinking about the things like preference for preference sake. So, you know, making environments where people like being there, not necessarily environments that we're worried about programming for reinforcers, or using preference as an indicator for social validity and that kind of stuff.
Woo,
has been where we're starting to move. My doctoral student, Ashley, and I have a lot of ideas that we have written down somewhere. I'm sure Ashley knows where they're at.
Fingers crossed, she's the doctoral student.
No, honestly, like she is the doc student, but she is so much more organized than I ever will be that when she graduates, I really don't know what I'm going to do with myself research wise. I'm probably gonna listen to this and be like, don't make me sound so great. Like she's really wonderful.
I'm sure you're great, Ashley.
So we have, you know, all of these kind of ideas around how the utility of preference assessment and what it really could be for, other than like, I found this ginger ale can and that's the reinforcer, and I'm going to give this thing to you over and over again as your reinforcer. So that's how I got here. I worked at Ball State for a couple of years in their online program in behavior analysis. I'm at GSU, Georgia State University now, and I'm an associate professor. I'm the former program coordinator, which I love emphasizing former.
Yes.
Because I don't want to program coordinate anything. I'm happy being the vice president of most things. I don't want to be president of anything.
Same.
Yeah, it's just not my thing.
That's how we do it.
So I've been recently promoted to associate professor, and I teach classes and mentor my grad students and get to do some fun research sometimes.
That's great.
Awesome.
Yeah. We're besties already.
Giving up that program coordinator stuff is like life-changing, isn't it?
I don't know. I've never done it.
You got to do it. You got to do it.
Just sounds good. Just sounds good.
So is the thing.
So we have 3 articles, Chris, that you recommended we discuss tonight when talking about kind of preference in general, and certainly preference among sort of, more, not exactly underserved populations, but populations who historically, individuals have said, I don't really know what they like. How would we figure it out? They don't have complex verbal behavior. So I guess we'll guess and hope for the best. So those articles are Assessing Indices of Happiness and Unhappiness in Individuals with Developmental Disabilities, a Review, by Dillon and Carr from Behavioral Interventions 2007. Review of the Choice and Preference Assessment Literature for Individuals with Severe to Profound Disabilities by Tullis, Canella Malone, Baz McGill, Yeager, Fleming, Payne, and Wu from Education and Training in Autism and Developmental Disabilities 2011. And Multiple Stimulus Without Replacement Preference Assessment, Reducing the Number of Sessions to Identify Preferred Stimuli by Richman, Barnard-Brak, Abbey, and Grubb from the Journal of Developmental and Physical Disabilities 2016. So, Chris, kind of to start off, and I asked this question tongue-in-cheek because I know there's a lot we can talk about with preference, but do you ever feel like preference assessments are just one of sort of those areas of the field, sort of like FAs, where it's like, yeah, we did a whole bunch of research, we get it, preference equals good, let's do it, do we need any more research? Like, why don't we just get out there, write the pop psychology books on the subject? Like, let's move on from the nitty-gritty preference assessment research, or am I like, no, you're crazy, there's so many fine-tuned variations we have to explore? So
yes and no. On the yes side, like there are only so many times that we can do like a Dillon and Iwata MSWO and then see if a reinforcer is identified. Like that type of progression, yes. I think we're pretty clear that observational methods, structured methods of assessing preference for people who are more severely impacted by their disability is relatively well validated as a way of predicting reinforcer efficacy. I still think in that area, though, there could be some general refinements, kind of like I think it was Jeff Tiger maybe has the article about functional assessments where I can't even remember what they were kind of like validating some of the reliability kind of stuff. I still need to go back and read still actually need to read the article. I was listening to him on a podcast. So some of those things, some of the validity and reliability and that kind of stuff of the methodology, I think that's helpful and can bolster the arguments that we make about rigor of the assessment, right? But really, in thinking about that literature, there's really not that much more other than thinking about efficiency and efficiency and really potency of the reinforcer. So when we have these very simple responses in our kind of traditional reinforcer assessment, it's like you're pressing a button over and over again, and that's cool. But that reinforcer may only be a reinforcer for these very simple operant responses versus these very complex things that we see in free operant types of environments. If you find out that an M&M is a reinforcer in a clinic setting, that's wonderful. But that M&M probably isn't going to reinforce these very long and complex chains of behavior in a typical classroom. And I find that out a fair amount because I do a fair amount of kind of clinical work or just kind of like informal consultation in school districts. I have a pretty close relationship with the Georgia DOE. And I do a lot of my own work in clinical settings because it's just a bit more controlled. And when I go into classrooms, I get a whole lot of like in the behavior plan, it said that these were the reinforcers, but they don't work. And the teacher and I will have a very long conversation about identifying reinforcers and how to tell whether something is or isn't reinforcing. But it's this very finite, like these are the reinforcers. So I think that there's some work there. Now with the general kind of, I guess, overarching kind of theme of preference, we need more research on kind of the boundaries of where we should be assessing for preference and how we should assess it. So I think about social validity being one of them. Happy people tend to have a happy outlook on on their environment. I know that's like the least behavior analytic way of describing that. And hopefully like no one strikes me down when I walk outside my door. But sometimes I tend to be less behavior analytic with my explanations. So there's that where, you know, these indices of happiness, like we could use that as a way of looking at social validity. And if somebody really isn't happy in their environment, well, then maybe we should change the environment so that we could figure out how to make them happier. I think a bit about some of the Hanley work where he's talking about being happy, relaxed, and engaged. Well, indices of happiness would be a really good way of measuring whether or not somebody's happy. And that's something that indicates whether or not this is a preferred interaction. So there's that area too as well.
I really love thinking about it from that perspective, right? Because so much of our preference assessment literature is just looking to identify a reinforcer. And, well, preference assessment on its own cannot identify a reinforcer, for one thing, right? It's just going to establish relative preference among the items that are being assessed. But even if you then go on and do a reinforcer assessment from there, then you have just established something that you could maybe utilize to teach a skill, but there's that back and forth intention of it, right? Like, I'm going to hold on to this for a while and then I'm going to give it to you, but you're not looking like you're talking about at the overall contextual use of preferred items. And we're looking like you were talking about, right? We're trying to establish a steady state, right, of happiness from, and only once you have that in place can you then have any real chance of adding in additional learning opportunities or demands. But we don't often think about or talk about preference in that way. How do we identify, like, what is that happy state, the bigger picture? So I love thinking about it from this perspective. However, the way in which we often assess preference, like toy by toy, doesn't necessarily lend itself to identifying those overall preferred environments or, you know, potentially synthesized environments that are going to contain multiple preferred items. Yeah.
And it kind of gets to like a quality of life thing, right? It's like, you know, people that have relatively robust measures of quality of life tend to be happier and they tend to prefer the things that they're doing. And I would love to see behavior analysts taking this very rich preference literature that we have and really talking about that preference for preference sake in that manner of, we've got this really great technology and we can change environments to help people be happier in these areas, whether it's therapeutic or just daily, independent living or any of those types of things. Like, we have this really rich literature. We're just only thinking about it in one way, and that's in identifying reinforcers. And I don't think that that's the best thing for us to do right now, personally.
Yeah. I think we've come so far from looking at, you know, the four condition FA and saying like, oh, well, this control condition has extra stuff in it, right? So that's going to serve as our baseline, independent of what those things are in that environment, right? I think we've hopefully as a field moved beyond just comparing, you know, a stark environment to an enriched environment, and how can we then best enrich that environment for that individual.
Yeah.
So I'd like to go back and like Chris, like you were talking about in terms of the indices of happiness, because I know indices of happiness is sort of a concept and it's something that one could observe. I remember doing a paper on it with a longtime friend way back in grad school for severe special education on indices of happiness. And then later on, when I was getting ready to take my DCBA exam, thinking about like, wow, I can't talk about things like happiness. Happiness, it's this like mentalistic term that's not observable. I don't know. I must have been reading the education literature back then. How embarrassing! And I know I've had so many people when either been supervising or consulting, when they're talking about, they seem upset, they seem frustrated, and I feel like I've had to overcorrect and be like, no, those aren't terms. We're not using those terms. And then you read the Dillon and Carr, and it's like, oh no, there's an important piece of literature looking at these indices of happiness, especially for individuals who don't have verbal behavior to express preference, or maybe due to their severe or multiple disabilities can't demonstrate any sort of preference by, pointing or by what we might think of as like a meaningful interaction with objects. So did you come to indices of happiness similarly, or is that something that you've kind of always known about? Or
So I think I ran across it probably when I was a graduate student. I think it was after we wrote the 2011 paper that I think I came across it and was like, whoa. And I was working in a segregated school setting for kids with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities in Ohio. And we had a lot of kids that had severe multiple disabilities. So I had an assigned nurse, like a CNA that was with them all day. And I was consistently wondering, like, you have this kid, this student that's in this classroom, and well, nobody's interacting with them. This was really not your shining example of like a good therapeutic or educational environment, unfortunately. Nobody's interacting with them. How do we know if they're happy or not? Everyone is reporting that they don't know what they like, but we can figure this out. So I ran across it then, and unfortunately, I was on my way to kind of transitioning out into my first faculty position, and just kind of kept reading a little bit about it because I thought that it was a really good concept. And agree with you, from my training, the whole using that loose language. I remember being in class, maybe not being in class, being in class with a couple of professors, and somebody saying, well, so-and-so was thinking. And they were like, thinking? How do you know they were thinking? Is there a thought bubble that you saw? Like, I had like this very like visceral reaction to like hearing that. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm holding onto the desk for you because this is going to be so bad. Yeah. But, once I got into it, and it, it's just kind of a placeholder term.
Yeah.
It's like, here's what we're saying it is, but here's how we're defining it. And in that, I was like, wow, this is a pretty good kind of concept to have, and a pretty great way of thinking about how you're content or happy in a situation. And then, when my wife and I were writing, Rachel and I were writing the BAT paper that you guys had in another episode, that was one of the big ones. I had my brother-in-law is diagnosed with ASD, and he's very vocally fluent. He can tell you what he likes and doesn't like. He's got no problems telling you what he doesn't like. But not everybody with an intellectual developmental disability does have that. And in seeing him go and have his own apartment, like he owns his own apartment and he lives on his own and all that other stuff, and he can say, I like doing this. Well, what do you do with other people? Like, how do you know that they like doing it? That's where I started thinking a lot about like this concept of preference for preference, and using those indices of happiness as a suggested way.
I was so jazzed when you sent the green and read paper. I read that paper pretty early on in my master's program, and my mind was blown. I was like, she's talking about happiness here. And then I moved to Illinois for a little bit and worked where, that research was done. And I was like fangirling, like heart-shaped eyes everywhere. Because I was like, this was I think that literally is probably one of my most favorite of all behavior analytic articles. Top 5, definitely. Nice. Because I think top five. Before that paper, I, always wanted my clients to be happy. But what was that, right? Again, if I would have said that in a class, I probably would have, it wouldn't have been great overall, right? I probably would have had the same experience of that.
It's like Chris is saying, it's like a whole devolvement from there. Yes. It's like, you can say that you're thinking about things, you can say that you're happy, but then are you prepared to then back it up with some operational definition of 100%. What you mean? We're not denying that people have emotions and thoughts.
100% no. Yeah. But I wasn't ready to back up that when I was a master's student, right? For that first year. Like, no, but I'm... Right now, I'd be like, I have that
same reaction if I say was able to.
Oh, me too.
Right. Well, we have the same advisors. So that's
why. But so I'm just so happy. And I would strongly, strongly, strongly urge listeners to read that paper too. And I try to incorporate it into almost all workshops that I do that are like mine, because I just love it so much.
Even if it's irrelevant, you're just like, you're just going to work it in there somehow?
It's a discussion. You always talk about happiness, right? Like, that should be the end goal.
Social validity.
Yeah.
That's actually some of the indices of happiness work is required reading my verbal behavior and skill acquisition class that I teach, because I think that it's so important to think about preferences and all that other kind of stuff in that manner. And students love it. I mean, I never thought that something that I thought was so like simple and easy and all that other kind of stuff like preference would ever be something that would get like an entire class of master's students like super jazzed up. Like, oh my God, this is so amazing.
I want to take that class, Chris. Coming down.
I'm trying to reformat my VB and skill acquisition class. I got some feedback on it that there was too much.
That's always the feedback.
I
There's a
get
lot.
that feedback as
They're
well.
not wrong. They're not wrong. I really,
Yeah.
I had too much in there. They were 100% right. Afterwards, I was like, what did I do? Why was I doing this? Like, no, reformat this class.
You got to go big, and then you kind of iterate. It's a
Yep.
little
Yeah.
smaller
Yeah,
as time goes on, right?
That happens to me too. You're just
Yeah.
so excited. There's just so much good material.
Yeah. I had to do a lot of editing on my staff management class that I'm teaching right now. So it's like, there's so much to read. And I'm like, nope, can't tell them to read everything.
Right. And then it's putting trust in the students and in yourself
Yeah.
that you're going to get the message across with less.
Yeah.
So, Chris, when you think about indices of happiness, and I like in the Dillon and Carr paper the fact that they use happiness, they use unhappiness, because I think when I think of indices of happiness, I'm like, well, we only really care about when people are happy, because we want to know when they feel good, so we can set up the environment so that they're more engaged and that they show more indices of happiness, and we're sort of hoping that leads to some sort of wonderful Elysian field setting for all of our clients that are consumers. But I do think having the unhappiness in that paper and in the review gets to a lot of what you're talking about in terms of preference for preference's sake, is that indices of happiness doesn't become like there are many preference assessments. This is probably the least precise one, but you can use it in a pinch. That's not really the point of looking at indices of happiness, right? I mean, that would be kind of a very narrow view of how you'd use indices of happiness.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know that I think in some of the stuff that you sent over, you were asking a little bit about, should this be a secondary measure? And I think in some instances, maybe it should be, but it really depends on what your purpose is, right? Like what is the question that you're asking? And in that instance, you would want the full range, right? Because you can have kind of neutral affect, or you can have, it's like meh, like it's all right, I mean, I like beer. I really like super great local craft beer that comes from 4 blocks away from my house. It's like my favorite stuff. I really don't like Bud Light.
Mm-hmm.
And if you give me a Coors, meh. Like it's really like that makes, it's kind of like in those instances, having that full range really is important. And when you think about teaching arrangements, or when you go into like educational settings and it's like inclusion opportunities and all that kind of stuff, you could almost use neutral to happy as being something that would be all right. Like kids in general, we don't want to be neutral to happy. But if you have a kid that's really unhappy by these indicators, and you could assume, or really not assume, but you would have some sort of data that would indicate that this is a lesser preferred environment.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't want to go to chorus. Not a preferred, that's not a preferred environment.
Why not?
Mm-hmm.
I liked the example in there too about if you were watching a sad movie, you may not indicate happiness, but that doesn't mean you didn't enjoy the activity as well. So it is something of an imprecise measure, which is why we likely would want to have it paired with some other engagement measure as well.
She only likes movies that go up, which is why we say Under Siege 2 with Steven Seagal is her favorite movie. Because he just kicks ass the whole way through the movie. There's
any dogs
there's no
are fine.
ebbs and flow. There's no like, oh, I'm not going to win at the end or beat the... No, I just keep winning over and over until the movie ends with me winning a last time. Favorite movie. She loves it.
That's all well and good. The other point I did want to make, though, is as well as if we're thinking about this as a measure, is that there may be a cultural perspective that we'd also want to bring in here as well, too, right? Because someone could be presented with something and indicate to you that they're happy with it because that's the cultural expectation, and yet really they hate it.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. We not really get away, but like my students and I were actually just talking about this in our ethics class about cultural responsivity and all that kind of stuff. Like we're living in Atlanta, 10 miles away from my house, probably less than that, is like one of the most culturally diverse little towns like in the entire nation, called Clarkston. And our ComDis folks, our speech clinic, has a speech clinic there. And I was talking about like the cultural themes that you have to know And also that you have to work into your therapy sessions and all that other kind of stuff that we're getting feedback from our SLPs. And this is another really good one, another really good point to bring in to preference and indicating happiness and all that other kind of stuff, is that cultural norms and that kind of, those kinds of cultural qualities do impact how all of that's being expressed.
Yeah. Is Clarkston the town where the mayor was on Queer Eye?
Maybe.
I think maybe it is.
The original or the reboot?
The reboot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a good friend of ours, when we were our good friend of ours, she's become a good friend of ours, but was our real estate agent. And she was like, Clarkston would be great. Clarkston would be great. Like, I don't know if I want to live that far from downtown.
You're right.
And my wife travels across the city to go to work at University of West Georgia. And she ended up buying a house in Clarkston. And it is like the coolest little funky town with like all of these immigrants that are there and local Atlanta people that moved to Clarkston. And I mean, it's just a really cool place.
Jackie has fact checked it for me.
Yes, it is.
The mayor was on Queer Eye.
Yep, Ted Terry.
Awesome.
And the town looked really cool.
Yeah, no, it's cool. There should be a documentary
cool
coming out about Clarkston in the next, I think, 2 years called Refuge.
Oh, cool.
All about the immigrant community in Clarkston that a friend of a friend is doing as part of a nonprofit. So good plug for their movie. I've donated some money to the production and all that kind of stuff. I got a cool towel and a hat.
Ooh, do you get a producer credit? You know, so that's where the money is.
I think I just got swag. It was like $40. I just got some swag, which I'm cool with. I like that.
So, when we talk about indices of happiness, again, I think a really neat paper for just some nice ideas on, how could we use indices of happiness, and going beyond just the idea of, isn't it nice to be happy? Like, doesn't that sound like a fun concept? Really looking at, you could use indices of happiness to determine, preferences for more than just, I like this toy or this item or this movie or this person that's next to me, as well as, what do I not like doing? Or I would enjoy this habilitative task or this vocational task. And, it is one of those pieces that, I mean, is the technology in terms of, like, I know they mentioned the Fun Time program multiple times, which, what a great name for non-contingently present items that, are associated with high indices of happiness, remove things when indices of happiness go away. I mean, it's not much of a program, I think, when we think of our programs, but it seems to be effective for a lot of the participants in those studies. Has there been like a next generation of some of that research, or is it kind of dead-ended or sort of morphed into other preference research?
To be honest, I think that, what they were describing when they talked about the Fun Time program is really pre-session pairing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like really like kind of what's become maybe best practice, standard practice in a lot of places in behavior analysis, where, your goal is, to make sure that this environment is being paired with all of these wonderful things and it's fun and all that kind of stuff. So I think potentially what they were describing has just been kind of given a different name, and not that. I wish that it was still that, though.
I'm thinking that's too. I'm like, what?
From now on,
the Fun Time program.
Yeah, whenever somebody's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, the Fun Time program. Like, pre-session pairing sounds very, very academic, but the Fun Time program sounds super cool.
Sounds very fun.
There's your simple study.
I feel like Grimace
as teachers
and the Hamburglar should be
in the Fun Time
program.
Yeah.
I know. If you're doing the Fun Time program for people in their like 40s or 50s, nobody knows who they are
like
anymore.
The Play Place, the Fun Time program should all be there.
We've lost all of our listeners under 35.
It's like a contextualized preference environment.
It's like, what is this? What's this boomer garbage you're talking about?
If you lose all your listeners under 35, it's like the vast majority of the field, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, that's a problem. It's like the entire field now.
We've dated ourselves.
Everyone's missing out on those cookies that came in those little boxes.
Oh, they were
so good.
That's like serious nostalgia. I think that when my daughter comes home one day with like apples, and we're like, what is this nonsense? Like, apples? No. No.
Didn't go to McDonald's for the fruit content,
Yeah, no. We get apples somewhere else. Like we get things that are more delicious at McDonald's.
Mm-hmm. You know it.
Well, that seems like a good place to take a break.
Okay,
and then when we come back, Chris will talk about some of your work on preference, maybe some more McDonald's talk as well. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
CBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Chris Tullis about Preference Assessment 2.0, or just more updates on preference assessment. So we were talking about indices of happiness, and now, Chris, I'd like to talk about your review paper that you wrote and you shared with us. But before we talk about that review paper, I want to make sure everyone out there knows that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is listen to the show and then send us your 2 secret code words on our website, ABA Inside Track. That's .com/getceus. That's GET-CEUS. And the first code word given to us by our special guest is Haven, Haven. And Chris, that's the name of one of your dogs, correct?
Yeah. It's the one that's been in 2 states, living in 2 states with me, and probably all over the eastern seaboard.
Aww.
Excellent. It's a good reason to have a code word, Haven. All right. So, Chris, in looking at your review paper, I know I always love reading a review paper because it saves me the trouble of having to track down all of the individual articles, because there's a nice summary I can start with, and then I'll pick and choose the ones most relevant to whatever I need. But you really went into the review paper with some questions, and kind of relating to what are the comparisons between preference assessment technology? What are the mechanisms that underlie preference itself? What effects do choice have? How do we teach choice in research, which surprisingly weren't as many articles as there were many of the other subjects? And that kind of always leads to the question of, were there other questions that you either hadn't thought of at the time, or looking back say, man, I wish I'd looked into this line of research, or that research didn't exist and I've started thinking about those next level questions? Like you mentioned, like you and your doctoral student are already thinking of more preference related questions.
Yeah. One of the things that I guess wish was present, or maybe that I was more aware of it, were things related to rigor of implementation of single case design kind of studies, which is something that we've been using now in our reviews. Mostly the single case assessment review form, I think is what it's called. It's called a SCARF. Jennifer Ledford and her crew at Vanderbilt put it together. It's a visual kind of depiction of rigor of studies. That's something that I think would be really valuable, especially for the choice types of studies. Like, how rigorous is this thing? Mm-hmm. You would be surprised at where a lot of articles score on some of the metrics of rigor.
Is it a holy scarf?
Not really. I think our last review that Ashley and I published, this was related on or this was not related research, but in behavior analysis, we don't do a really good job of describing our participants. We don't do a great job of like certain things related to rigorous experimental implementation. It has nothing to do necessarily with the data, but just the actual implementation, which increases your internal validity, right?
Right.
We don't do a really good job at it. And without assessing that rigor, we're kind of missing out on areas that at least researchers need to be keying in on. So that was something that I wish that I would have probably known a little more about. I think the Reichow, Brian Reichow had a 2009 paper that has some standards. I was brand spanking new into doing it. That was actually the first paper that I wrote when I was in grad school. So I was brand spanking new to this whole like research thing. And had no idea that that paper was even out there until probably like 5 years later, when I really was like digging deeply into experimental rigor.
That happens sometimes.
Yeah, right. I found lots of things. I'm like, whoa, I wish I would have known about this.
Mhm.
You can't read everything all the time, right? So that is something that I wish that we would have asked about. And then also asking, questions related to the potency of the reinforcers identified after, getting this measure of preference. But those I think would have been the two major ones. A lot of other questions got answered in the intervening years, at least experimental questions that we kind of thought about or identified, things like qualities of reinforcers, like how we identify those. I think Frank Chacon and Rick Graff had those papers where they're like picking apart stimuli. One of my classmates and I had that exact conversation one day after class. It's like, well, what if we like figure out like how chocolatey something is? Can we like pick it apart and then find other things that are equal to blah, blah, blah. And I think like 2 months later, Rick Graff had a paper that came out. And it's like, this man must have a microphone in my apartment or something. He keeps publishing these great ideas and I have them. Like, stop publishing.
Yeah.
Stop doing it.
Special
Stop doing it.
for that one. It's hilarious because they had that data for like 10 years before they published it. Both those articles.
I mean,
I love that study.
It really like, that's really kind of it's like this like understated profound thing. It's like identify preferred stimuli or preferred properties of stimuli.
Right.
Because if you can identify that somebody likes crunchy stuff or somebody likes music in a musical, well, then you can feasibly find other things that are similar in nature and use those as well. So that was something that we talked about, or that I talked about when I wrote the paper. I don't think it's in there. That was answered afterwards. So there were other things that were answered after the fact. And then things like efficiency, which is around the Richman paper, that was something else that kind of came about from that paper.
I know I was pretty surprised at just how few articles there were on sort of training preference, especially outside of the field of training other behavior analysts or direct care staff to run preference assessments, because I think it was the Roscoe article. I know I'd read that, and I did that for a lot of my training for staff in public schools, but they were staff in specialized programs, but I kind of used that sort of the TA and then some of the training modalities that were mentioned in the article. And I love that. And preference assessment's one of those, I feel like, slam dunk easy things to train. And I'm thinking, and you might know some more, like, did those questions ever get answered of like, and we taught mom and dad, or we taught classroom teacher to run a preference assessment? Like, have there been a couple since then?
I think there are some classroom teacher papers. I'm almost pretty sure.
I think you mentioned one, or it was like a component of one of the studies you reviewed, but it didn't seem like it was very thorough, or they didn't look at like procedural integrity. There were some limitations with the
and
at the time.
And I think that's one of the general limitations that we find in behavior analysis is that we're not really necessarily translating the Fox paper about disseminating the covenant or whatever. We're not really translating it into those natural change agents all the time. I think there are some preference assessment papers that are recent-ish that focus on classroom teachers. I would have to go back and look again. Parents, though, no, as far as I know. But I don't know if it's really necessary for parents to know that stuff. Like, I think that it's necessary for parents to know about preference and maybe informal ways of figuring out if something is or isn't liked by their kid. But I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing to teach parents these very systematic types of ways of interacting with their kids. This is a revelation after having a child.
Right.
Really, this is a revelation after having a child. I was a great parent until I had a kid. And then I was like, oh, I don't know lots of things. Yeah. But, in thinking about some of our procedures and thinking about how we train parents, we've got to teach parents how to be like just a little more observant of things and maybe a little more systematic in how they interact with their kids. But we don't need to teach them how to be therapists. And I think we start teaching them things like a preference assessment, then you're going to have mom and dad in the morning that are like, here are the 30 things that we can interact with today.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't need that, but teaching them things like, present choices to your kid when you're doing lunch, or present choices when you're doing these things.
Ways you can naturally build in those types of choice opportunities into the day that might be more helpful for parents. Although, there is literature that says that even close caregivers may not be able to identify all of the items that are then identified through preference and stand up as reinforcers. So the take-home message for parents wouldn't be, oh, you already know exactly what it is that your child wants. Not to mention, and we've touched on it, just how fleeting preference can be. There's so many variables that are going to influence what may be preferred or reinforcing at any given point in time. So the message wouldn't be, oh, you already know your child well, you don't even need to ask, but rather, let's find creative ways to build in those opportunities to ask and present choice all the time.
I'm kind of laughing because I feel like as a field in the past few years, we've been very much really trying to like empower the families we work with and empower the parents we work with. You know your kid best. You understand, the environment best. You understand what treatments are going to work best. Except for preference, you have no clue what you're talking about. That's like the one area.
Not always, but you
Not
do.
always.
And then sometimes you do. Sometimes it holds up, right? The thing that you think is the number one is the number one.
That's true, but I don't see a lot of articles published and being like, parents had no clue what we compared parents' guess of the function and the results of our FA, and they were way off. But, we see that statistic all the time looking at, parents guessing or parents assuming was, they picked poor preference when we did the preference assessment. They were way off base with what would function as a highest preferred item or what would function as a reinforcer. And again, I don't think it's meant to, besmirch parents' knowledge of their children, but just the idea of just looking and just like, I think they like this not being as meaningful step in terms of determining, what you want to be using for a reinforcer.
I went to parents' night the other night at school, and they give you a little sheet, and your child has already filled the sheet out with all of their favorite things. And then it's a game, and you, without peeking, have to fill out what you think your child put, and then check it. And I got like a 15% correct on that thing. And you think that you're going to do well. But even
Child
as I was
services
filling
waiting
out,
outside,
I was
they're
like,
like, ma'am,
I'm like making wild guesses here. I'm like, chicken fingers, basketball, like, I don't know. And I did bad.
Well, it makes sense though. Like you said, function of problem behavior is usually not fleeting, right? It's usually, there's usually a past history of reinforcement there that is maintaining a problem behavior. Preference can change from minute to minute depending on different motivating operations, right? So I can see why we wouldn't know, right? Because one day you could love chicken nuggets. The next day you could hate chicken nuggets.
See, now that just makes me even sadder because it's like, as parents, we understand the worst things our children do better than the things that bring them joy.
I think it's just more durable.
No, I understand the concept you're going at. I'm trying to make some sort of
You're trying to be
artsy farts. No, I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just trying to be profound. I don't know.
Yeah.
Failing, perhaps.
Larger point there, Chris, was we want to teach parents how to interact with their kids in a functional, naturalistic way and not introduce additional structure where there doesn't necessarily need to be.
Yeah.
Although sometimes preference assessments are a fun game.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think that if we're keeping kind of like, and this may honestly just be like totally my preference and viewpoint of things, is that, if we're making sure that we're keeping in mind that parents are parents, and not parents are therapists, then we have a lot of leeway, just as long as we're not like, we're going to learn an MSWO today and we're going to collect data on it and graph it, and then you're going to find reinforcers and you're going to use these only for can't do it.
Right. It's too much.
Yeah, too much.
So, Chris, I kind of had put this question just more as like a general starting point for conversation, but now I'm kind of curious because you wrote your review. You said it was one of the earlier things you published. When you were done, did you have any kind of broader thoughts about preference assessment, either methodology or preference assessment procedures that you either have held with you all these years, like this preference assessment is the best because I read a ton of articles, therefore I feel I know the answer, or any sort of thoughts that you had then that you've kind of disabused yourself of over the years? I know I'm kind of hoping that you'll say, and I put it in there sort of jokingly, like, can we get rid of multiple stimulus with replacement? Like, do we have to mention that exists anymore?
Oh man, I just now thinking about it, I realized that was 10 years ago. Since like a decade of my life has passed. Wow. There weren't really any big things that I kind of held on to. I think that, when we were reading all of those articles, that one of the biggest things that kind of, was really cemented was that people are using paired choice and multiple stimulus, MSWO assessments, right? Seemed to be the most reliable, easiest to implement, all that kind of stuff. And then MSWs and single stimulus assessments kind of peaked at one point, and then they were like supplanted. It's almost like, the difference between dinosaurs. It's like this peaked and then you died out and then something else popped up, and you may still have some vestiges of the DNA around. One of the big things that looking back on it, that still don't totally know is, well, are these things going to have utility? And we don't have a good decision-making model for what preference assessments are good for whom. Lil and Allen and I think Shriver have a decision-making model that was just recently published that I think has some good potential. And maybe in that you would find that for specific considerations, something like an MSW might be indicated. We just don't know yet. And I think that's where, like I said, some of those questions were slowly but surely being answered, because you have a couple of different kind of decision-making models that came out of the preference literature. Karsten has one, and Bruce Ortega has another one, and then Lil has a different one. And they're starting to answer those questions of, well, who is this going to be really good for? Because there are lots of considerations when you're implementing kind of in the real world, out in clinics or out in classrooms, that you have to think about before you just take the Fisher and colleagues methodology and then you just do it. You got to think about other contextual variables and skill-related variables that aren't described in Fisher or in De Leon.
And I think in your paper in the discussion section, especially because I usually read papers in chronological order because I like to sort of think about the development of the concepts. But after having read about indices of happiness and then reading your review and then in your discussion, I'm expecting, preference assessment. Everyone loves preference assessments. Preference assessment literature is always fun to read. They get great results. And I think out of the 19 or so studies, I think there were like 14 or 15 that all had positive results. And that's great. I kind of, you start an article on preference assessment, you assume it's going to have some good results. But then when you start discussing the preference assessment research with the mixed results, especially thinking about indices of happiness, thinking of individuals with more profound disabilities, and really seeing that the mixed results might be kind of that signal or that clarion call of, just because we have these procedures that can work, they're not foolproof. There are going to be populations that we haven't looked at. There are going to be situations and contexts that we haven't studied preference assessments under. And really kind of just thinking about, oh man, sometimes I think it's so easy to just think of it as like, I'm going to give you your 7 items and then we've got our reinforcers and I'll slap them on your DRO program, Jackie, right? And and I'll give it to the teacher and bye.
I hate them with a super, super passion. And I'm teaching an intro class right now, and we're like, let's talk about DROs. But I hate them. So if you use them in your application assignments or talk about them as your treatment, you will get a 0. A full-on 0 if you're not pairing it with
Jackie,
something else.
Always for 0.
I found a plan I'd written recently. I'd written like a couple years ago, and it had a DRO that had been pretty effective. But I almost, like, looking back on it, I was like, oh, I just got to change this just because I know if I miss Jack's going to yell at me.
Just change it to an A. And then
I like to put the reasons I change a plan for like the future. It's like, my colleague will make fun of me if she realizes this.
There are very limited reasons why you could use a DRO. I can say
you
that.
can almost always improve on a DRO.
Yes. That's true.
I think I've told a couple of students that it's a good like emergency.
Yeah.
If you don't know what to do right now, you can use a DRO, get things under control, and then change it.
Yeah. I know Jackie will come in and know that you're doing a DRO.
Yeah. Like, you should be actively trying to make sure that you have something else.
Right?
But this is like the emergency brake, guys.
Right. Exactly.
Oh gosh.
And so, I mean, I think kind of when we talk about the questions, and you brought up a lot of them either tonight or in the research, Chris, but kind of thinking about the multiple stimulus, the Richman article. To some extent, I think I read an article like that, and I'm like, wow, we're saving 5 minutes per with looking at how many sessions we're running, we can save 5 minutes per session. You could run more preference assessments. While I do think that efficiency is very important for sort of like the day-to-day practitioner, clinician, I do think sometimes that direction of preference assessment research misses a lot of the points that you brought up in terms of, well, we still have good questions, like bigger questions about how are we utilizing preference in our planning? You know, are we using it to help with identifying quality of life indicators for individuals? Could you talk more about your thoughts on that subject, either in the papers or just, you know, your thoughts nowadays?
So
you know,
on pursuing that line of research versus pursuing others?
Yeah, just kind of the more big picture kind of utility of preference.
Yeah, you know, I still think the Richman article or those types of investigations are really important. The Richman article, so they have a larger sample size. I have a brief reporty kind of paper with just one participant prior. And, you know, when I look at those papers, I look at that being kind of the immediate, like, boots on the ground utility. You know, it's the, I don't golf, but I used to drink and drive golf carts. I grew up in Augusta. We had the Masters golf tournament. Everybody golfed.
So
I would drink beer and I would drive golf carts around. But people talk about putting for show and driving for dough, right? And that's the putting for show part. That's like, I know that that if I pursue this research, that it can be productive, that it can be impactful, and it's the immediate payoff. Like, I can immediately do this. Now, the other end of it are these bigger, massive questions like implementation. So how do I, you know, implement indices of happiness in these other bigger programs? So taking the implementation science kind of track, like, how do I make this happen in these big organizations? Those are all really great questions. They're just really big questions to ask. And I think where we get is that those big questions cost big money. I'll be honest, like, big questions cost big money, which means funding and finding funding and all that other good jazz. And so asking those big questions gets difficult unless you have a way of asking them. So while I think that they're super important and I hope people are attempting to ask them, it's figuring out how to get the mass behind you to get those done. And that's kind of, I think, where some like not really theory, I guess, papers, but more like commentary papers are going to be useful. Is to kind of start getting people in behavior analysis, behavior analysts to think in terms of this big picture idea and gathering some small bits of data or some small investigations together that hopefully can like spur on this bigger question asking. So I think that they're both very good lines of inquiry. It's just whether or not where you have the opportunity to do one over the other.
That's true. And again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm dissing the Richman article. Those are like my favorite preference assessment articles to read, because they sort of just feel like, when you find like a mystery series and you really enjoy them and you read all of them, even they're like, I know that it's the new person who moved to the small Maine town. I know they're going to be the killer, but they're still fun to read because you're like, I love these characters. I love the MSWO character, and I love the idea of like, how can we make this go faster, and like, will the results be stable across this many sessions versus that many sessions? So it's
a little formulaic, and
that's actually a critique about that. Some of those papers about the stability issue, where it's like over 5 sessions and 3 sessions, we're looking to identify reinforcers, right? And so if I can identify it by giving you one thing, well, then I don't care if on the 5th one you're still selecting it. I care whether or not it's going to function as a reinforcer. When I read the 5-3-1, like all of those papers now, I'm like, I don't really like it all that much, guys. Mostly because, if we can establish that this is going to produce a reliable reinforcer, then why do we need to test it against all this other stuff to see if it's consistent? It doesn't really matter.
Right. And sometimes those types of questions just get bogged down in like the academia of it all, right? Like we're all just trying to prove to one another something that we already actually know.
Yeah.
But we can't let that prevent us from then going on to tackle the larger questions that may influence quality of life.
Yeah.
But 5 minutes, we can say 5 minutes per session, I think was the summary at the end of the Richman, which is good, and it would allow you to run more preference assessments, which might deal with some of the stability. But again, are we just asking a question of like, I need to run like sessions today with a student, and we're going to do the same discrete trial program 20 times, and I got to make sure that we can get through that session successfully. Like that's good, but is it missing the point?
Bigger, yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think that one of the big points, especially with the efficiency questions and preference assessments themselves, is when you start advocating or training people in kind of those more naturalistic environments that are less controlled. So I think about classrooms, in Georgia, we have 2 adults to, I think, 8 kids in a classroom, something like that. And if you say 5 minutes per kid, let's say that you do this every other day, 5 minutes per kid, you're saving 40 minutes of time during the day. And that 40 minutes of time is pretty valuable in a classroom context. And that's where I like that research a lot. And that's why I hope that it starts being implemented more in those naturalistic environments, especially since we have really good training materials. I mean, there's the Graff and Karsten self-training stuff.
I love that. It's so good.
I think it's wonderful. I've given it to people that were supervisees, and I'm like, well, you train yourself how to do this, and then we're going to come back and we're going to see if you got it. Jason Veladescu has some stuff on video modeling and training preference. I mean, we have the technology to train natural change agents to be able to do this. So it's kind of like, now it's time to train them on these very efficient things and see what happens. And that's another kind of area really of research that is appropriate, like the social validity question of our training and our assessments and everything else that should be endeavored upon. I know social validity is a messy area to research, but
necessary.
And necessary part necessary.
Of it, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that we've covered the articles, and I think it's time to sort of wrap up with some summary from our expert guest here. So let's move into dissemination station. I had a new idea. I didn't know what sound effect you'd make, but I had a new idea for a segment of the show. But I'm not going to make everyone sit through it. But I was really grumpy when I was reviewing my notes. Not because of the notes or anything, Chris. It was unrelated to the show completely.
Rob's having some sort of existential crisis.
I'm always in I'm constantly in a state of existential crisis. And I was like, you know what I want? We got to have a section of the show where something grinds my gears. So what would that sound effect? What would that
That's what it would sound like, right? That would be annoying, but yes.
Okay,
I was talking about grinding your gears.
That's good. Give me another take.
Let's try. That really burns my butt.
Oh, so that would be your section of the show.
Then you'd be like.
So, Chris, when I was sort of thinking about what's going to be the summary question, we looking at preference assessment research summary question, and originally it was going to be sort of the very basic, so what's the best preference assessment and how do we run it most efficiently? And after our discussion, well, I think that's still a good question. It's not that exciting a question. So I don't know if we want to sort of give a general answer to the basic, here's a good way to do a preference assessment, everybody, if you need a preference assessment, and then get into more of the, what are we doing with choice literature? What's next for how we're going to leverage, these procedures for more than just, look, I found the 7 things that you like, and I know the first 3 you'll probably push the button really fast for, and the bottom one, you might also push the button fast, but, so I don't know. Which direction would you rather go in as our guest? What question are you interested in answering of those? Or a totally different one?
I think the kind of what's next in this literature, actually, I'm starting to read a bit more, or I'm starting to go back into the literature a bit more. We're hopefully going to be starting on the kind of follow-up to that paper. So the previous paper, the Canella, Riley, and Lancioni paper in 95, right? 95? God, it's a long time ago. So the paper that I wrote was a follow-up on Helen's paper. So Helen was my advisor at Ohio State. So that was and that's how I kissed up to my advisor at first.
Your paper was great. What if I wrote a sequel? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to do this thing. What do you think? So, and now thinking about, it's been a while. It's been 10 years. And there's a lot of stuff that's evolved in the literature, and kind of next steps, I think, are really big things. It seems like it's this very pedestrian body of work, right? But there are some really interesting things that are present. Some of the work that Matt Broadhead has done with video, and that's, again, efficiency and portability. Some of the work that's been done in training by Jason Veladescu and other folks using more technology-based types of training, I think, is another really good way of pushing the literature in that direction. So there's still some of those next steps. And then really, I don't want to fanboy Rick Graff too much, but there's a lot of stuff that he had published that really should be replicated because the data are so solid, and the training there, the methodology are incredibly novel. and really, really applicable to clinical practice. So a lot of that stuff should be, replicated more than once. Hanley's work on shifting preference, that's another really valid thing that should be, continued on in future work. So I think there's still a lot to be done to extend the literature. It's just going to take a little of, going away from, I did this assessment and I found a reinforcer. Like
Right.
that's like the simple, that was I don't want to say low hanging fruit, because that's, kind of insulting to the folks that came before, but those were the questions that were in front of them at that point in time. And they've been relatively thoroughly answered, but we still have these other areas that really, really are kind of ripe for further research. So doc students and master students, you still got stuff to do.
Right.
All
And
right.
Yeah.
And faculty.
Oh, that's excellent, Chris. But seriously, if someone was like, I need a preference assessment quick, which one would you go to? I'm not
Those
telling you the
Richman-
context.
yeah.
Pick one.
Those Richman procedures are fast and they identify reinforcers.
Okay.
So that would be your number one preference.
For
For
preference.
preference
Yeah, okay,
assessment.
no,
number
there's
one-
the study.
number
Preference
one
for preference assessment.
My number one, once upon a time when I still did clinical work, which I don't do that stuff anymore, any clinical work anymore, but that was like my go-to.
Mhm.
It was those procedures, and if they didn't identify reinforcers, then we would figure it out from there. But
Yeah.
that was kind of where we started.
I love a brief MSWO.
Mhm.
Same.
Yeah. It's, there's a quote from Doug Carnine. It's in like a 1997 paper talking about teachers, that teachers want things that are efficient and effective. And if you can have efficient and effective technology, then people will pick it up and use it. And I think that's still very powerful and a reason to keep kind of pursuing efficiency and effectiveness all at the same time, if it's possible.
Mhm. I sort of want to combine some of the Matt Broadhead's video preference assessment with like a smaller MSWO and all of like the new like distance learning kind of technology that's come out in the past few years, or at least it's become more popular in the past few years, and sort of be like, look, teachers, put your pictures on the board and the kids, vote online for their favorite. And then bam, there you go. You did 20 preference assessments in 5 minutes. Now there's some time savings right there. I did the whole class in less than 5 minutes, but who knows if that would work, but that might be worth kind of digging into the sort of the boring step-by-step piece of things.
And you would be surprised that there are most likely gen ed teachers that are out there that have already started doing stuff like this.
Oh yeah.
I was supervising a student now like 6 or 7 years ago in a inclusion classroom, and there was this rock star teacher. I don't even know where this woman came from. She's probably my mom's age. Like, was killing technology. Like, everything was great. Like, her class was chaotic but controlled. It was beautiful. Like, I walked in and I was like, I'm not here to see you. Or walked out, I was like, I'm not here to see you, but this is awesome. Like, this made me feel really good about, moving into this little city. Please don't retire anytime soon. But, you'd probably find a fair amount of teachers that are using things like Class Dojo and like all the online or the little clicker voting systems to come up with preferred stimuli for their individual PBIS framework classroom stuff.
Yeah.
So
preference assessments alive and well, preference itself alive and well, and more research, more questions to come. It's all very exciting. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight, talking with us all about your research, sharing some other research, kind of your thoughts for research in the future. If folks have like questions or want to reach out to kind of either talk about your review or to ask you any kind of questions about preference assessments or anything, is there a place that they can contact you?
Yeah, they can shoot me an email at ctullis2@gsu.edu.
Thanks once again to Dr. Christopher Tullis for being on the show and turning what I was sort of expecting to be a pretty straightforward discussion of preference assessment methodology into one that I think got into the bigger picture of why we do preference assessments and how we can move beyond simply what's the fastest way to determine a hierarchy of 4 or 5 items. So thanks again, Dr. Tullis, for being on the show tonight. I also want to make sure that everyone out there is thanked by the opportunity to get 1 learning credit by getting that second secret code word. And again, this one is from Dr. Tullis as well. It's Reptar. Whether you're talking about Dr. Tullis's cat, Reptar, R-E-P-T-A-R, or the dinosaur character from the hit 90s Nicktoon Rugrats. Who remembers Rugrats? This show is for old people, apparently. It's a dinosaur monster. I think Rugrats is coming back. You'll get a chance to see it again. But that code word, Reptar. All right. Well, thank you once again for listening to ABA Inside Track. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please rate and review us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to get podcasts. A lot of other ways you can find us. You can find us on all the social media as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of our episodes, as well as links to the articles discussed and to purchase CEs for almost all of the episodes that we do. If you would like more ABA Inside Track, why not go over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe. We have a whole new bunch of levels where you can subscribe for $3 to get our episodes a week ahead of time, or you can subscribe at our $5 level to get access to more activities that we'll be doing throughout the year, including some live episodes. Or if you really say, you know what, I need huge, long discussions of books in behavior analysis or related fields with my ABA Inside Track friends, you can join at the premium $10 level as well to get 2+ hours. Most recent book club we did over the summer was for the book The Other End of the Leash on dog training. We just had a poll go out, so we'll be doing a topic on sustainability this November. So again, check us out at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And we couldn't make the show without a lot of fabulous people. So some big thanks to, of course, Jackie and Diana. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Jim Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!